At 81 years old, Cora Whitfield discovered that to her own sons, she had become something they no longer knew how to carry, an old woman in a house that had quietly stopped being hers. While Gerald and Theo sat across from her with rehearsed expressions and printed brochures, pointing toward a facility with soft lighting and scheduled meal times, Cora said nothing. She simply folded her hands in her lap and thought of a rusted old deed sitting at the bottom of her travel bag, a piece of land nobody had spoken of in years. What her sons called forgotten, Cora called unfinished. And what waited for her on that wild, abandoned stretch of Texas hill country would shock every single person who had ever underestimated her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Cora Whitfield had lived with her eldest son, Gerald, for 2 years, ever since a mild stroke had frightened the family enough to insist she couldn't stay alone in the small house she'd owned for decades. She hadn't wanted to leave. That house in Kerrville had been hers for 31 years. The kitchen where she'd canned peaches every August, the porch where she'd read through entire summers, the garden she'd tended like a second child. But Gerald had been persuasive, and Theo had backed him up, and eventually Cora had packed her things and driven south to San Marcos, where Gerald and his wife Patricia lived in a large, modern home with an open floor plan and a guest room that smelled faintly of paint. That had been 2 years ago, and in those 2 years, Gerald's home had remained Gerald's home in every way that mattered. It wasn't that anyone was openly unkind. Gerald provided for her. Patricia kept the guest room clean. Theo called every Sunday, reliably, though the calls rarely lasted more than 10 minutes. On the surface, everything looked like a family taking care of its own. But Cora felt the truth of it in quieter ways. In the way Patricia would exhale slowly when Cora shuffled into the kitchen during dinner preparation, never saying anything but never quite making room, either. In the way Gerald would turn the television volume down slightly when she entered the living room, a small, unconscious signal that her presence had interrupted something. In the way they stopped asking her opinion about anything, family decisions, weekend plans, even where to order dinner on Friday nights. As though her perspective had a shelf life, and it had simply expired. She was 81. She moved slowly. Her hands shook occasionally, a tremor that had appeared after the stroke and never fully left. She needed her reading glasses for everything now, and sometimes she repeated herself without realizing it. These things were real, and she didn't deny them. But they were also, in her estimation, entirely manageable. She wasn't confused. She wasn't helpless. She was simply old, and old, she was beginning to understand, was something her family had decided to treat as a diagnosis. The conversation she had been quietly dreading for months finally came on a Wednesday afternoon in March. Gerald called her into the living room with the careful, neutral tone of a man who had rehearsed what he planned to say. Theo was there too, on the large screen mounted to the wall, his face slightly pixelated from the video call, joining from his apartment in Austin. Patricia sat on the armchair near the window, present but slightly apart, the way people sit when they want to be witnesses rather than participants. Gerald had printed materials on a coffee table. That was the first thing Cora noticed. Brochures, she realized, as she lowered herself onto the sofa. Folded pamphlets with photographs of smiling white-haired people sitting in sunlit common rooms. "Mom, we've been doing some research," Gerald began, and Cora recognized those words for what they were, not the start of a conversation, but the opening of a verdict. "We've been talking, the three of us, and we think it's time to consider a more supportive living situation for you." Cora looked at him steadily. "What kind of supportive situation?" Theo cleared his throat from the screen. "There's a really well-regarded place in New Braunfels. Cedar Ridge Senior Living. It has a memory care wing, though you wouldn't need that, but also assisted living apartments that are really beautiful. There's a garden program, activities every day." "I have a garden here," Cora said. "Or I did before last fall." Patricia shifted in the armchair. "Cora, the concern is really about safety. What if something happens and we're not home? What if you fall?" "I've lived alone before, Patricia." "That was before the stroke," Gerald said, not unkindly, but firmly. Mom, we have to be realistic. You need a level of care that we honestly can't provide. We both work. We're not home during the day. If something happened to you here, alone, nothing has happened. Something could. Gerald leaned forward. We're not saying this to hurt you. We're saying this because we love you and we're worried. Cedar Ridge has a nurse on call around the clock. There are people your age there, people talk to. You wouldn't be isolated. I'm not isolated. I'm here with your family. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it said everything. Cora looked at her son, then at the pamphlets on the table, then at Theo's pixelated face on the screen, and she understood with complete clarity that this, too, was not a conversation. It was a notification, politely delivered, but already decided. She reached out and picked up one of the brochures. Cedar Ridge Senior Living. Comfort Community Care. She sat back down. I have a question, she said quietly. Whatever happened to my mother's property? The land outside Fredericksburg she left me. Gerald frowned slightly. That old place? Mom, that's been sitting empty for years. Nobody's touched it since Grandma passed. But it's still in my name. Technically, yes, but it's just land. Overgrown. The old house is probably not even structurally sound anymore. Cora nodded slowly, as if simply processing the information. Inside, something had shifted, quiet, certain, and entirely her own. Then that, she said, is where I'll go. Gerald stared at her. Mom, that's not serious. It's entirely serious, Cora said. She set her hands flat on her knees, a gesture she had always used when she wanted people to understand she was not negotiating. I'm not going to Cedar Ridge. I'm not going to any facility. I'm going to Mother's property, and I'm going to figure out what to do with it. Theo's voice came through the screen, higher pitched than usual. You can't live on that land. There's nothing there. There hasn't been anything there for 20 years. Then I'll have plenty of room to work. Patricia spoke carefully. Cora, with all due respect, that's not a realistic option. You're 81. That property has no electricity, no running water, no infrastructure of any kind. It's not safe. Neither is being somewhere I'm not wanted, Cora said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The room went very quiet. Gerald rubbed his face with both hands. Mom, we're not saying you're not wanted. We're saying we're worried about you. There's a difference. Maybe, Cora said, but the outcome feels the same. She stood slowly, steadying herself with the arm of the sofa. I'll be gone by the end of the week. You don't need to help me, and you don't need to worry. Consider your responsibility fulfilled. She walked out of the living room before anyone could respond, and she did not look back at the brochures on the coffee table. It took her 3 days to pack. She was methodical about it, the way she had always been methodical, sorting through 2 years of accumulated belongings and deciding with clear eyes what she needed and what she didn't. She took her clothes, her books, her mother's old recipe box, the small framed photographs that had sat on her guest room dresser since she arrived. She took her gardening gloves, worn thin at the fingertips. She took a canvas bag full of supplies she'd ordered online, a camping stove, a water filtration kit, a good flashlight, a sleeping bag rated for cold nights. Gerald knocked on her door the second evening and stood in the doorway, watching her fold sweaters into a suitcase. Mom, please think about this. I've thought about very little else for the past 2 years, she said without turning around. He was quiet for a moment. At least let me drive you out there to look at it before you commit to anything. I've already committed. But thank you, Gerald. He left without another word. On Friday morning, Walt Greer, her neighbor from her old Kerrville house who had stayed in touch all these years and driven 2 hours just because she'd called and asked, arrived in his pickup truck and helped her load everything into the bed. He was 72, broad-shouldered, and deeply uncomfortable with what he was witnessing, though he kept it mostly to himself. Gerald and Patricia stood in the driveway. The goodbye was stiff and brief, full of things nobody said out loud. Theo had sent a text the night before that read simply, Mom, please be careful. Call me when you get there. Cora had not responded. She climbed into the passenger seat of Walt's truck, and they pulled out of the driveway, and she did not look back at the house. The drive from San Marcos to the property outside Fredericksburg took just under 2 hours. For the first hour, they traveled on familiar highways, the kind of wide Texas roads lined with gas stations and feed stores, and the occasional hand-painted sign, advertising pecans or honey. Walt drove steadily and didn't push conversation, which Cora appreciated. She watched the landscape through the window and thought about her mother. Eleanor Whitfield had bought that land in 1961 with money she had saved for 11 years working as a seamstress. 43 acres of hill country, rocky and cedar thick and stubborn, exactly like Eleanor herself. She had built a small house on it with the help of a neighbor and her own 2 hands, planted a garden, kept chickens for a while, and lived there quietly and contentedly until her death in 2003. Cora had inherited the land but never done anything meaningful with it. Always too busy, always too far away, always telling herself she would get to it eventually. Eventually had stretched into 20 years. She wondered now what her mother would think of all this. Eleanor Whitfield had been the kind of woman who trusted difficulty, who said, without irony, that the hardest roads led to the most worthwhile places. Cora had always admired that about her mother, but hadn't been sure she possessed it herself. She was beginning to think she might. The second hour of the drive was different. The highway gave way to county roads, the county roads gave way to gravel, and eventually Walt turned onto a rutted dirt track so overgrown on both sides that branches dragged along the truck's mirrors with a sound like slow applause. The GPS had given up 20 minutes earlier, but Cora remembered the turns. She had been here as a child, and the land had a way of staying in the body even when the mind let go of it. Then the trees opened up and she saw it. The house was small and gray and almost entirely consumed by vegetation. Vines covered the front wall from foundation to roofline, thick as rope in places. The porch had partially collapsed on the left side, one corner dipping toward the ground like a tired shoulder. The windows were dark and filmed with decades of dust. A large cedar tree had grown up directly beside the chimney and was pressing against it with quiet, patient force. The yard was not a yard anymore. It was a wilderness of waist-high grass, cedar saplings, and tangled brush that had erased every boundary and reclaimed every inch of clear ground her mother had ever fought for. Walt stopped the truck and sat looking at it. He didn't whistle. He didn't say anything. He just looked. Cora looked too. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Well, Walt said finally, "It's yours." "Yes," Cora said. "It is." She opened the truck door and stepped out into the warm March air. And she stood at the edge of what had once been a garden path and looked at the collapsed, vine-wrapped, weed-swallowed ruins of her mother's dream. And she felt something move through her that she couldn't quite name. Not despair, not courage exactly. Something older than both. Something that had been waiting in her chest for a very long time, patient as a seed. She pulled on her gardening gloves. "Let's start unloading," she said. Walt stayed until sundown. He helped her pry open the front door, which had swollen so severely in its frame that it took both of them leaning their full weight against it before it finally gave way with a sound like a gasp. The interior was dim and close, the air thick with the particular stillness of a place that had been sealed against the world for a very long time. Dust lay over everything in a soft, even coat. Furniture sat beneath old sheets like figures frozen mid-movement. The floorboards groaned under every step, but they held. It wasn't as bad as it looked from the outside. That was the first thing Cora noticed, and she held on to it. The bones of the house were intact. The stone fireplace in the front room was solid and uncracked. The kitchen, though stripped of anything useful by time and mice, still had its original cast iron sink and the long wooden counter her mother had rolled pie dough on for 40 years. The staircase to the upper loft was steep but stable. The roof had leaked in at least 2 places, leaving dark stains on the ceiling boards, but it hadn't collapsed. Walt helped her carry her things inside, setting them in the front room where the floor was most level. Before he left, he stood at the door with his hat in his hands, looking the way men look when they're trying to find the right words to talk someone out of something without actually saying so directly. "Mrs. Whitfield, I'll come back Monday. And if you need anything before that, you call me." "I will, Walt. Thank you for this." He nodded once, put his hat back on, and walked to his truck. She watched his taillights disappear into the trees, and then she was alone. The first night was the hardest. She set up her sleeping bag on the old sofa in the front room after pulling off the sheet and beating the dust out of it on the porch. She lit her camping lantern and ate a cold meal of crackers and canned soup she didn't bother to heat, sitting in the amber light of the lantern with the sounds of the hill country coming through every gap in the walls. Crickets whined through the cedar. Something small moving in the walls, a mouse or a lizard. An owl somewhere distant and unhurried. She did not sleep well. Her back ached from the truck ride and the unloading, and the sofa was shorter than she was, and at some point in the night she heard rain begin on the roof, a sound that would have been comforting in any other circumstance, but here simply reminded her of the water stains on the ceiling. She lay in the dark listening to the rain and thinking about Gerald's face when she had told him where she was going. The mixture of frustration and something else, something she recognized as relief, the relief of a man who had found a solution to a problem he hadn't known how to solve. She thought about that for a long time. Then she stopped thinking about it because it wasn't useful, and she had never been a woman who spent energy on things that weren't useful. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In the morning, she began her assessment. She moved through the house room by room with her lantern and a notepad, writing down everything she observed. Roof leaks above the kitchen and the loft. Front porch structurally compromised on the left side. Plumbing non-functional, pipes likely corroded through. Electrical wiring original and decades beyond safe use. Mice had been through the kitchen thoroughly. One window on the ground floor had lost its glass entirely and been colonized by a determined climbing vine. The upstairs loft had a crack in the exterior wall wide enough to see daylight through. She wrote it all down without editorializing. Problems were just problems. They had solutions, or they didn't, and you didn't know which until you looked at them clearly. Outside was a longer assessment. The yard, if she was being generous, extended about 30 feet in every direction before dissolving entirely into the native brush. Her mother's garden had been along the south side of the house. She remembered that much, but there was no visible evidence of it anymore. The old cedar fence posts were still there, barely, listing at irregular angles like old teeth, but everything between them was indistinguishable from the surrounding wilderness. She walked the property slowly, stopping often, reading the land the way her mother had taught her to read it when she was a girl. Soil color, water movement, what grew where and why. The land was not dead. That was what she kept coming back to, what kept steadying her when the scale of the work threatened to overwhelm her. Neglected land and dead land were entirely different things. This soil was dark and alive. Things were growing here with tremendous enthusiasm. They were simply growing without direction, without intention, without anyone to shape them towards something purposeful. She understood that feeling completely. She went back inside, made coffee on the camping stove, and started making a list of what she needed. It was a very long list. She wrote it all down anyway. Tomorrow, she would begin. The first 2 weeks were defined entirely by work and exhaustion. Walt returned on Monday as promised, bringing supplies she hadn't thought to order and a quiet competence that made him invaluable. He helped her patch the worst of the roof leaks with salvage materials, stabilize the collapsed porch corner with new lumber, and board up the broken window until a replacement could be ordered. He also connected her with a local man who installed a small solar panel system and a generator backup, giving her basic electricity for the first time since she'd arrived. The day the lights came on inside her mother's house, Cora stood in the kitchen and laughed out loud, alone, to nobody. She established her routines the way she had always established routines, through repetition and stubbornness. She woke at first light, made coffee, walked the property for 30 minutes before the day's heat set in. She spent the mornings on physical work, clearing brush from around the house, pulling vines from the exterior walls, cutting back the cedar saplings that had seeded themselves everywhere with the particular ambition of cedar trees in Texas. She spent the afternoons on the house itself, cleaning, organizing, making the interior livable in increments. Her body resisted the work in ways it hadn't 20 years ago. Her lower back sent clear signals every evening that it had reached its limit well before she was ready to stop. Her hands, despite the gloves, blistered and then toughened. She moved slowly and deliberately, the way people move when they have learned to respect their own limits without being defeated by them. She took breaks she wouldn't have taken at 60. She rested without guilt. Gerald called on the 10th day. "Mom, you've made your point. This is enough now." "I haven't made a point, Gerald. I've moved home. That place is not your home." "It is now. How are the kids?" He sighed heavily. "They're fine." "Mom, seriously." "Good. Give them my love. I have to get back to work." She hung up and went back outside. The discovery happened on a Thursday afternoon in her 4th week at the property. She had been working her way through the house methodically, and she had saved the back room for last. It had been her mother's workroom, the place where Eleanor Whitfield had spent her evenings at a long wooden table surrounded by things Cora had never paid much attention to as a child. Drying bundles of plants hanging from the ceiling beams. Small labeled jars lined up on shelves. Notebooks stacked with the careful precision of someone who considered their records important. The room had been locked when Cora arrived. It took her 2 weeks to find the key, small and iron, tucked inside the lining of an old coat in the bedroom closet, as though her mother had hidden it deliberately or simply forgotten where she'd put it. When Cora finally opened the workroom door and stepped inside, the smell hit her first. Dry and herbal and complex, like something between a pharmacy and a forest. Remarkable, she thought, that after 20 years of abandonment, the room still held that scent so strongly. She stood in the doorway for a long moment before stepping fully inside. The drying bundles had long since crumbled, reduced to dust and skeletal stems that broke apart when she touched them. The jars on the shelves were still intact, sealed tightly with wax, their handwritten labels faded but legible. She moved along the shelves slowly, reading each one. Plant names, some familiar, some she didn't recognize at all. Dates going back as far as 1959. Small notations beside each label in her mother's precise, seamstress-trained handwriting. Then she found the notebooks. There were 11 of them, stacked in 2 careful piles on the long wooden table, covered in a cloth that had kept the worst of the dust off them. Cora sat down at the table, the same table where her mother had spent thousands of quiet evenings, and she opened the first notebook. What she read over the next 3 hours changed everything. Her mother had not simply been a gardener. Eleanor Whitfield had spent 4 decades documenting and preserving medicinal herbs, specifically the wild and semi-wild varieties native to the Texas Hill Country that were rapidly disappearing as land was cleared and developed. She had been systematic about it in a way that astonished Cora. Each plant was documented with its common name, its folk name, its known medicinal applications as passed down through generations of rural Texas families, its growing conditions, its harvesting seasons, its preparation methods. The notebooks reference plants that Eleanor had collected from old homesteads before they were demolished, from family farms before they were sold, from stands of native growth before they were cleared. She had grown them here, on these 43 acres, and she had saved their seeds and documented everything she knew about them with the quiet dedication of a woman who understood she was preserving something the wider world was carelessly discarding. The last entry was dated November 2002, for months before Eleanor died. "My hands aren't steady enough for this work anymore. I've done what I could. Someone will find this eventually. I hope they understand what it is." Cora sat at her mother's table in the fading afternoon light, and she read those words 3 times. Her throat tightened in a way she didn't try to fight. Someone will find this eventually. She had found it. 81 years old, dismissed by her sons, driven out to a piece of land everyone had forgotten existed, and she had found it. She closed the notebook carefully and held it in both hands and sat very still in the quiet workroom while the Texas sun moved down toward the cedar ridge outside the window. Then she stood up, tucked the notebook under her arm, and went to put the kettle on. She had work to do. The morning after finding her mother's notebooks, Cora woke before dawn. She lay in the dark listening to the hill country settle into early morning, the owls going quiet, the first birds beginning, the wind moving through the cedar in long, slow waves. She had slept better than she had since arriving, which surprised her. She had expected the weight of what she'd found to keep her awake, turning it over, second-guessing herself. Instead, she had slept deeply and completely, the sleep of someone who had finally located the thing they had been searching for without knowing they were searching. She made coffee and took it outside to the porch steps and sat watching the sky lighten over the cedar ridge to the east. The property looked different to her this morning. Still overgrown, still overwhelming in its scope, still a long way from anything resembling order. But the chaos felt purposeful now in a way it hadn't before. Somewhere beneath those decades of unchecked growth, her mother's garden was still out there. She was certain of it. Eleanor Whitfield had planted too carefully, too deliberately, for everything to have simply vanished. After coffee, she went to the south side of the house with her mother's 5th notebook, the one dedicated entirely to garden layout, and she began to read. Her mother had drawn maps. Careful, precise, hand-drawn diagrams of the garden beds with each plant labeled and its position noted relative to fixed landmarks. The old cedar fence posts, the limestone outcropping along the south boundary, the shallow draw where rainwater collected after heavy storms. Cora walked the south side of the property with a notebook open in one hand, matching her mother's diagrams to the landscape in front of her, and slowly, the garden began to reveal itself. Not visually, not at first, but structurally. The cedar fence posts were still there, and their positions matched the notebook exactly. The limestone outcropping was exactly where Eleanor had drawn it. The shallow draw was still there, still collecting water, a dark line of lusher vegetation cutting through the drier brush. And when Cora crouched down in the area where the first garden bed should have been and pulled back the layers of dead grass and leaf litter, she found soil that was dark and distinctly different from the surrounding ground. Amended soil, worked soil, her mother's soil. She spent 3 days clearing the south side, working in the cool morning hours with focused patience, cutting back brush and pulling the surface layer of accumulated debris away from what lay beneath. And on the 3rd day, she found the first survivor. It was growing in the far corner of what had been the second garden bed, a small cluster of gray-green plants with narrow, aromatic leaves, unremarkable in appearance, the kind of thing most people would pull without a second thought. But Cora recognized it from her mother's notebooks. She went inside and confirmed it, cross-referencing the leaf shape and the growth pattern against Eleanor's detailed illustrations. It was Turk's Gap sage, a variety her mother had noted as increasingly rare in the wild as early as 1975. And here it was, growing quietly and stubbornly in the ruins of Eleanor's garden, waiting. Cora sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long time. She found 7 more survivors over the following 2 weeks. Most were in poor condition, stressed, and overcrowded by competing vegetation, but alive. Each one she carefully cleared, amended the surrounding soil according to her mother's specifications, and documented with photographs and notes in a new journal she had started keeping. She was doing what her mother had done, she realized. Recording everything, preserving knowledge, working with patience towards something she might not live to see fully completed. Walt's daughter-in-law, a practical woman named June who taught high school biology in Fredericksburg and had heard about the eccentric elderly woman living alone on the old Whitfield property, stopped by one afternoon out of curiosity. She stayed for 3 hours. When Cora showed her the notebooks and the surviving plants, June went very quiet in the way people go quiet when they understand they're standing near something significant. Mrs. Whitfield, she said carefully, I think I need to talk to someone at the university. Cora looked up from the garden bed she was clearing. What university? UT has an extension program here. There's a researcher there who specifically studies native medicinal plant loss in the Edwards Plateau region. She's been working on this for years. June paused. The plants you're describing, the ones in these notebooks, some of these are on her watch list. Plants she's been trying to locate for her research. Cora looked at the gray-green cluster of Turk's Gap sage, small and stubborn in its cleared patch of dark soil. Then perhaps, she said quietly, she should come and see what my mother saved. June made the call that evening. Dr. Pendleton arrived 4 days later. Dr. Pendleton arrived on a Tuesday morning in a dusty university truck with a graduate student named Felix and a field kit that suggested she had come prepared to be impressed or disappointed, whichever the evidence warranted. She was younger than Cora had expected, somewhere in her early 40s, with the focused, slightly distracted energy of someone whose mind was always partially elsewhere, processing things the rest of the world hadn't noticed yet. Cora walked her through the garden first, then the workroom, then the notebooks. Dr. Pendleton said very little during the tour. She crouched beside plants, examined leaves, cross-referenced her own field guides with Eleanor's illustrations. She read passages from the notebooks with the careful attention of a person reading something they had been looking for without knowing where to look. Felix photographed everything quietly behind her. When they finally sat at Eleanor's long wooden table with tea, Dr. Pendleton placed her hands flat on the surface and looked at Cora directly. "Mrs. Whitfield, do you understand what your mother built here?" "I'm beginning to," Cora said. "These notebooks are an extraordinary ethnobotanical record. The plants she documented, the folk medicinal knowledge she preserved alongside them. This is exactly the kind of intergenerational knowledge that disappears when elderly rural communities are dispersed or pass away without documentation." She paused. "And the surviving plants. The Turk's Gap sage alone is significant. But the others you've found, if they're what your mother's record suggests, this could be one of the most intact private collections of native medicinal species in this entire region." Cora poured more tea. "What would you like to do about it?" Dr. Pendleton looked at her with something that resembled relief. "I'd like to help you restore it. Properly. With resources and research support. We have grant funding specifically for this kind of recovery work. We could bring graduate students out here to assist with the clearing and planting. We could digitize your mother's notebooks, cross-reference them with existing research, identify exactly what you have." Cora was quiet for a moment. "My mother didn't preserve these things for them to become a laboratory." Dr. Pendleton nodded immediately. "I understand that completely. This would be your project, your land, your mother's legacy. We provide support. You maintain control. The goal isn't extraction. It's restoration and documentation. A living record, not a collected specimen." Cora considered this for a long time, looking out the workroom window at the south garden where her mother's survivors were slowly recovering in their cleared beds. Then she nodded. They began the following month. What happened to the property over the next year was the kind of transformation that happens when the right resources meet the right purpose at the right moment. Graduate students came out on weekends and cleared the remaining garden beds with careful, informed hands, guided by Eleanor's notebook maps. The soil was amended and prepared. Seeds collected from the surviving plants were germinated in a small greenhouse Walt helped Cora build from salvaged timber and polycarbonate panels along the east side of the house. Dr. Pendleton's team identified 4 additional species in Eleanor's seed collection that had been considered locally extinct for decades, their seeds carefully preserved in wax-sealed jars and still viable after 20 years of undisturbed storage. Each successful germination felt to Cora like a conversation resumed across time. Her mother had started sentences 40 years ago that Cora was only now finishing. The house itself was fully restored by midsummer. Walt had organized a small crew of local men who worked weekends, and between them they replaced the roof, rebuilt the porch, repaired the cracked exterior wall, and restored the plumbing and electrical throughout. The house that had been gray and collapsing when Cora arrived became something clean and solid and deeply itself again, the kind of house that looked like it had always known what it was. But it was what grew outside the house that drew people. Word spread the way things spread in small communities, through conversation and curiosity. A woman in Fredericksburg mentioned the restoration to her garden club. The garden club visited. One member wrote about it for a regional newsletter. The newsletter reached a journalist who covered sustainable agriculture and native plant conservation across the Texas Hill Country. The journalist came, spent an afternoon with Cora, and published a piece that was shared widely online. Within weeks, Cora began receiving letters and emails forwarded through the university. Some were from researchers. Some were from elderly women who had read about what she was doing and wanted to know if they could come and help. Some were from families who had inherited similar collections of old notebooks and dried plants and had never known what to do with them. She responded to all of them. The elderly women came first. Agatha arrived from Comfort, 78 years old, and a lifelong herbalist with knowledge she had been carrying alone for years with nobody to pass it to. Lorraine came from Kerrville, 69 and recently widowed, looking for something to do with the long, quiet days. Evelyn drove 2 hours from Bernie because she had spent 30 years as a nurse and understood medicinal plants better than most doctors she'd worked with. Mabel came last, 81 like Cora, sharp-eyed and deliberate, who said on her first day that she had been waiting for something like this without knowing it existed. They became the core of what the property was quietly becoming. Not just a garden, a community. Gerald came on a Saturday in October, 7 months after Cora had left San Marcos. She knew he was coming because Walt had seen an unfamiliar car turn onto the dirt track and texted her from the greenhouse where he was working. Black SUV. Expensive looking. Cora had smiled at her phone and set it face down on the porch railing and waited, hands wrapped around her morning tea. She heard the car before she saw it. The sound of city tires moving uncertainly over a road they weren't designed for. Then it appeared through the tree line and parked at the edge of the cleared yard. Gerald got out first, then Theo, who had apparently driven up from Austin to join his brother. They stood beside the car and looked at what was in front of them. Cora watched them see it. The house was fully restored, its limestone exterior clean and solid, the rebuilt porch hung with drying herb bundles and flanked by deep garden beds bursting with late-season growth. The south garden was visible from where they stood, laid out in careful beds separated by stone pathways, dense with plants in every shade of green and silver and gray. The small greenhouse gleamed along the east wall. Hand-painted signs identified plantings. Gravel paths moved through the property with clear intention. It looked nothing like the ruin they had dismissed. It looked like something that had been loved back into existence. Gerald picked his way up the path toward the porch, Theo behind him. Agatha and Lorraine were working in the far garden beds, and both looked up as the two men passed. Agatha said nothing but watched them with the expression of a woman reserving judgment. Gerald stopped at the foot of the porch steps. "Mom, Gerald, Theo." Cora kept her voice even. "This is unexpected. We should have called," Theo said. He looked genuinely uncomfortable, which Cora noted. Gerald looked around slowly, taking in the restored porch, the herb bundles, the signs, the garden spreading out behind them. "Mom, this is remarkable. What you've done here." "What I've done," Cora said, "but what you expected." Gerald had the honesty to hold her gaze. "Both, I suppose." She gestured to the chairs on the porch. "Sit down." They sat. For a moment, nobody spoke. A woodpecker worked steadily at one of the cedar trees along the property edge. From the greenhouse came the faint sound of Walt whistling something tuneless. "We heard about the university partnership," Theo said finally. "Gerald showed me the article. We had no idea, Mom. About grandmother's notebooks. About any of it. Nobody asked," Cora said. "That wasn't sharp, simply factual. You had already decided what this land was worth before either of you ever thought to look at it." Gerald leaned forward, elbows on knees. "That's fair." He said it quietly, and she believed he meant it. "We treated you the way we did because we convinced ourselves we were being responsible. Practical. We told ourselves it was about your safety. And was it?" He was quiet long enough that the answer was clear. "Partially," he said, "but not entirely. It was also about convenience. About not knowing how to make space for something that didn't fit our lives neatly." He paused. "You deserved better than that. I know that now." Cora looked at her eldest son, the boy she had raised through a difficult childhood and an uncertain adolescence, the man he had become, capable and successful and genuinely limited in ways he was only now beginning to understand. She felt something complicated move through her. Not forgiveness, not yet, perhaps not ever in any simple form, but recognition. She could see him clearly, his smallness and his potential both. "Why are you here, Gerald?" she asked, not unkindly. He and Theo exchanged a glance. "We wanted to see you, and we wanted to apologize properly. In person. And Theo said, we wanted to know if there was anything we could do to help with any of this." Cora set down her tea. She looked out at the south garden where her mother's plants were thriving in the October light. She thought about Eleanor, patient and unrecognized, preserving things the world was too careless to notice. She thought about the 11 notebooks and the wax-sealed jars and the quiet faith of a woman who worked without any certainty that anyone would continue what she started. She turned back to her sons. "I'll tell you what I told Walt when he helped me move in," she said. "I don't need rescuing. I never did. What I need are people willing to do the actual work." Gerald nodded slowly. "What kind of work?" Cora stood and picked up her gardening gloves from the porch railing. "Follow me," she said. She led them into the south garden without looking back, and after a brief moment of hesitation, both of her sons followed her down the gravel path between their grandmother's surviving plants, into the work that was already waiting. Winter came gently to the hill country that year. The gardens went quiet in the way gardens do, pulling their energy downward into roots and soil, storing what they had gathered across the warm months against the cold ones. Cora had expected to feel the slowness of winter as a frustration, the enforced pause after a year of constant forward motion. Instead, she found she welcomed it. There was a different kind of work that belonged to winter. Documentation, planning, the careful, unhurried work of putting things in order so that spring would have something solid to build on. She spent her evenings at Eleanor's long wooden table, updating the property journals, corresponding with Dr. Pendleton's team about the coming year's planting schedule, writing letters to the families who had reached out about their own inherited collections of old notebooks and dried plants. There were 11 of them now, families scattered across the hill country and beyond who had read about what Cora had built and recognized something of their own histories in it. 3 had already brought their collections in person. 2 more had agreed to donate them to the preservation project in the spring. Her mother's work was expanding outward in exactly the way living things expand when given the right conditions. Gerald and Theo came back. That surprised her more than she expected it to. Gerald came 3 Saturdays in a row through November, arriving early and working without complaint alongside Walt and the graduate students, learning the difference between plants worth saving and invasive species worth removing, learning to read the garden the way Cora was slowly teaching everyone who came here to read it. He brought his youngest daughter the 3rd Saturday, a 16-year-old named Claire who had her great-grandmother Eleanor's dark eyes and an unexpected interest in the medicinal notebooks that made Cora quietly glad in a way she couldn't fully articulate. Theo came once before Christmas, stayed 2 days, slept in the restored loft bedroom. They talked more in those 2 days than they had in the previous 2 years. He asked her about Eleanor, about the property's history, about what she planned for the coming years. He listened in a way he hadn't listened before, without the underlying impatience she had felt from both her sons when she had lived in Gerald's house. She didn't tell either of them that everything was forgiven. It wasn't not completely, and she had decided she owed nobody a forgiveness she didn't genuinely feel. But she could hold the injury and the relationship both. She had learned that. Could remember clearly what had been done and still choose to move forward. That was not forgiveness exactly. It was something more demanding than forgiveness. It was the decision to continue. In February, Dr. Pendleton called to tell her that a paper documenting the property's collection had been accepted by a peer-reviewed ethnobotany journal. The paper listed Eleanor Whitfield as the primary collector and Cora Whitfield as the preservation and restoration lead. Cora sat with that for a long time after the call ended. Her mother's name in print in a scientific journal. Credit given 40 years late to a seamstress from Fredericksburg who had understood something important that the wider world had been too busy to notice. She thought that Eleanor would have laughed at the attention. Then she thought that perhaps Eleanor would have felt, quietly and privately, that it was right. Spring came and the gardens woke. Cora stood on the porch on a morning in March. 1 year almost to the day since she had driven away from Gerald's house in San Marcos, and she looked at what the property had become. The south garden was fully restored now. Every bed her mother had laid out in those careful notebook diagrams planted and tended and beginning to show the first green of the new season. The greenhouse was running at capacity, germinating seeds collected the previous autumn, continuing the work of propagation that would eventually distribute these plants to other gardens, other preserves, other places where they would take root and persist. Hand-painted signs along the paths named each plant in 3 ways: its common name, its folk name, and Eleanor's personal notation from the notebooks. Agatha was already in the far beds with her tools. Lorraine arrived through the tree line on foot, the way she always arrived, having decided she preferred to walk the half-mile for where she parked her car. Evelyn and Mabel pulled up together shortly after, the way they almost always did now. Walt was in the greenhouse. Felix from Dr. Pendleton's team was expected by mid-morning. Claire, Gerald's daughter, had asked if she could come on spring break. Cora had said yes immediately. She went inside and made tea and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the south garden while the kettle heated. She thought about the woman she had been a year ago, sitting in Gerald's living room looking at brochures for Cedar Ridge Senior Living, listening to her sons explain with careful patience why her time for living on her own terms had passed. She thought about the drive out here, the rusted deed at the bottom of her travel bag, Walt's face when he saw the house for the first time, the smell of the workroom when she first opened the door, her mother's handwriting on 11 notebooks, the Turk's Gap sage growing quietly in the ruins of the second garden bed, waiting with a patience that had outlasted everything the world had thrown at it. She thought about what she had built here, not just the restored garden, not just the preservation project, not just the university partnership and the documented collection and the growing network of families bringing their own inherited knowledge forward into the light, but the community. Agatha and Lorraine and Evelyn and Mabel, women who had been told their useful years were behind them and had come here and discovered that was a lie. Walt, who had driven 2 hours just because she called and asked and had never really left. Claire, 16 years old, and reading her great-grandmother's notebooks with genuine curiosity. Gerald, in his work gloves, learning to tell one plant from another. This was the real thing her mother had preserved. Not just the plants. The understanding that old things still mattered. That knowledge accumulated over a lifetime was not diminished by age, but deepened by it. That the world's habit of discarding its elders was not wisdom, but waste. A carelessness that cost everyone something essential. Cora was 81 years old. Her hands shook sometimes. She moved slowly and deliberately and rested when she needed to. Her body was not what it had been, and she held no illusions about that. But she woke every morning with purpose that filled the day completely, and she went to bed every night having done work that mattered, and she lived inside a community that saw her clearly and valued what she brought to it. That was not diminishment. That was not the end of something. That was a life fully and precisely lived on ground that was entirely her own. She poured her tea. Outside, the hill country garden was waking into spring. Her mother's plants were coming back, as they always came back, patient and persistent and magnificent in their unhurried way. And Cora Whitfield, 81 years old and entirely unfinished, set down her cup, pulled on her gardening gloves, and walked out into the morning to meet them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.